Good afternoon. Thanks so much for having me, Oren. I am honored to be with all of you and grateful for this invitation and for the thoughtful work of Oren Cass and American Compass. Rebuilding American capitalism provides a blueprint for the future of conservatism. It's not a hyphenated conservatism or a new conservatism. This is far from an exercise in rebranding from my perspective. Rather, it's a conservatism that, inspired by its principles, doesn't shy away from the responsibility of actually governing effectively and seeking solutions to America's most pressing challenges. Not the challenges of 40 years ago, but the challenges we're experiencing today. And this work is, of course, not simply about the future of conservatism, although it is to some degree about that. By rousing our movement to rise to this moment and giving it the intellectual material to do so, you're setting the stage for a second American century. Now, let me briefly go back a couple of centuries. In 1809, a pair of New York state legislators traveled to Washington. They had a meeting with Thomas Jefferson, then president. They had hoped to earn Jefferson's support for the construction of a long-discussed but yet unrealized canal linking the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. The president was inspired by the idea, but he couldn't quite support it. Quote, "It is a splendid project and may be executed a century hence, but it's a little short of madness to think of it at this day," unquote. Those were the words of Jefferson. Nearly a decade and a half later, in 1825, the Erie Canal was complete. The nation's economy and industries flourished in the years that followed. Though his wisdom was beyond dispute, this was a rare example of Jefferson's imagination letting him down. In this case, he underestimated the power of American innovation. Why do I share this anecdote? Well, it's a reminder, I hope, to all of us. It's a reminder that we conservatives should be careful not to suffer from our own lack of imagination today. We should never underestimate this nation's ingenuity. Right now, we need both. Look at the task before us. We have to adjust America's economy for a new century to find pathways for more workers to meaningfully participate in it, for families to benefit from it, for its wealth to spread more widely. Only if our citizens are reaching their potential can our nation outcompete China in the global struggle now underway. The future, after all, belongs to and will be governed by the values of the nation that innovates with the most urgency. History proves that. With faith in what the American people can accomplish with the right tools and without needless restraints, the hour calls for a policy framework that unleashes the dynamism that has appeared over and over across our own history. Renewed prosperity and national security will follow. Let's call it an innovation agenda. The first piece was put in place last year. Oren mentioned it. This was the bipartisan coalition assembled in Congress to pass the CHIPS and Science Act. It's both a national security and economic development investment in our people and our places, our intimate communities that have indeed been overlooked for too long. And it effectively put America on the offense against Beijing. That's because the CHIPS and Science Act secures our country, it gives our people the tools to flourish, and ensures America continues its global leadership role. Much of the funding goes toward ensuring that more Americans have the requisite skills to work in the industries of the future. That, of course, is semiconductors, but it's also hypersonic systems, artificial intelligence, autonomous systems. The law is already jump-starting semiconductor production here in the United States. An emerging domestic microchip industry will provide jobs, and it will prevent future supply chain stoppages and safeguard our military readiness. And it will, I believe, help bridge the economic opportunity gap that divides our citizens. Construction of a corridor of the semiconductor industry is already underway in the heartland in places like Indiana. The CHIPS and Science Act is a significant first component of an innovation agenda, but I believe it's only the first step. I hesitate to call our federal immigration laws a system, since that would imply some organization, some intent. But we have to bring what passes for our immigration system in line with our values and with our interests. That means ending the lawlessness and inhumanity at the southern border. That's the easy part. But it also means making more Americans out of high-skilled workers who seek to immigrate here illegally. Elsewhere, China dumps undervalued products and subsidizes its industries, distorting the free market and harming American workers. Their companies move portions of production to other countries to circumvent duties, a practice known as country hopping, hurting our domestic industries. Protecting American jobs and fighting back against China's unfair trade practices will require strengthening trade remedy laws. We also need to encourage more crucial research and development. That means allowing American businesses to fully deduct R&D expenses. Right now, if one of you owns a business located in China, you invest $100, you can deduct $200 from your taxes. You make that same investment on a business located right here on American soil, you deduct $10. That needs to be remedied. And we need to assist workers and entrepreneurs so they can freely apply their talents where their skills are in greatest demand by scaling back the overuse of non-compete agreements that negatively impact American workers. I am writing, or I have already introduced legislation to address every one of these challenges. But I want to also acknowledge other suggestions made in rebuilding American capitalism, including removing unnecessary red tape and regulation, slowing new infrastructure projects without eliminating important environmental protections, and encouraging more public-private investment in new American industry. To Oren and all of American Compass, your work will continue to inform our agenda. With your help, the future of conservatism will be built on high ideals, daring ideas, and I hope limitless imagination. Together, we will renew the American promise and guarantee that this remains the land of the free. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
And you covered everything, so now I feel like it's open season. I can ask any question.
Just go for it.
Yeah. I want to start with a slightly bigger picture question, because I've really enjoyed when I've had the opportunity to speak with you the extent to which I think you really start from first principles and think about how do we actually think about the economy? What is the role of public policy? What are we trying to accomplish? And I think you really outlined that well as the basis for all of those policies. I'm curious if you don't mind sharing, how do conversations with your colleagues go about some of that? Where are the places where you find resistance to some of the things that you feel strongly about? What are the arguments that you find most persuasive, or that others find most persuasive when you make them?
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I appreciate your thoughtfulness. I enjoy our conversations. And when I came into the Senate in 2017, I was in the early stages of a big rethink. I was trained, to the extent I'm trained conventionally in economics, I was trained at the University of Chicago. This is where Hayek did so much of his important work. This is where Milton Friedman made his name. This is where so many of us learned our economics. It germinated from the scholarship of the University of Chicago. And I knew at the point in life at which I attended business school at the University of Chicago, I didn't have the stamina or the metabolism to get a PhD in economics. So I concentrated on economics while getting an MBA, which is a bit of a fudge, but I have some fluency in economics.
I think most people would say it was an incredibly wise. It speaks well of your judgment that you.
Oh, thank you. So it was an amazing experience, but the models I learned, I have to admit, were starting to wear poorly. Right around the 2016-27 timeframe, and I think it took me a while to sort of pay attention to and trust my lying eyes. There were dying communities that needed reinvestment. Our dependency in the most manufacturing-intensive state in the country, which I represent, on other countries to make things that are essential to assemble automobiles and to assemble our phones and so forth. We were losing the capacity to make these things. Rank and file Hoosiers were telling me that lack of manufacturing capacity had national security implications, and somehow that didn't fit the economic model, perhaps best popularly articulated by the Wall Street Journal Ed Page. So, it takes a bit of courage, and in my case, maybe it took some exasperation, just being tired of not having adequate answers for many of my constituents, and not having my curiosity satisfied about why these traditional supply and demand curves were not addressing the needs on the ground. And so I did a lot of reading. I consulted with some heterodox thinkers around town, and I changed the model, at least in my head. And I'm constantly revisiting the model and trying to adjust it. So here's why I share that. I think all of my colleagues are either going through this process or must go through this process, or increasingly they're going to hear the blowback of their own constituents. Because the traditional economics still apply. Supply and demand are still, we must respect these forces, and the free market is something we have to continue to embrace. But we also need to know when the market breaks down. And if you can walk people from their traditional understanding of economics to explain when market failures are occurring and why they're occurring and how they need to be addressed, it actually works. But you almost always have to start there, because that's when your listener, your fellow Republican or fellow conservative, conversationalist is beginning in this journey. And it can apply to employer-employee relations, the non-compete agreements. It can apply to the weaponization of our supply chains by a state capitalist country, in which case your traditional comparative advantage analysis doesn't apply. But you really need to start where people are. Sales 101, like Dad taught me.
You would have been a good salesman, but we're glad you're here. So let's talk about the Chips and Science Act for a minute. I found it a fascinating case study in something that I think absolutely needed to be done, and also showed all the challenges with trying to do it. That is, I would be the first to concede to those who say, well, if you try to develop a policy to support a particularly important industry, you're going to have all of these special interests in there. You're going to have all these fights. And from my perspective, the answer is yes, you are. And the result isn't going to be perfect, but my gosh, it's better than nothing. I'm curious what sort of lessons you learned, what was harder than you expected, and if we are trying to do the same sort of thing over again in other contexts, what do we know now?
This was not an easy sell, and this was a difficult journey, right? It really was. And you're still selling. You're still trying to persuade people, even those that supported it, that they made the right decision. So let me first say that about the Chips and Science Act. But if you really spend a little time with this issue, it's pretty clear that you cannot run a modern economy without computer chips. And we have to at least be somewhat independent as it relates to our national security needs from other countries for these computer chips. They have to be trusted. That is, you can't have any things embedded in them by the Chinese or others. If they're going to go into your nuclear missile submarines, if they're going to go into your radar systems and so forth. But what you very quickly discover when you analyze this is in order to have the capacity to manufacture the very high-end logic chips that go into our weapons platforms, you need to achieve the scale required to invest in the R&D on an ongoing basis. You also need the manufacturing expertise that only comes with making the commodity chips that go into phones and toys and so forth. So you have to reconstitute much of the entire ecosystem if you're going to become national security independent on chips. Now that's the national security nexus, which I think is the strongest argument for chips and science. But there's also, I think, a more accessible argument, which is, wait a second, don't we have like millions of jobs in this country that are dependent on a robust auto manufacturing industry? Of course we do. A lot of good wages, a lot of communities revolve around the local auto plant. A lot of communities revolve around the very extended supply chains that are associated with those auto plants. And isn't that valuable to us just from a civic standpoint? Shouldn't we support those communities? Absolutely, we should be supporting them. Well, they need computer chips, and they need a reliable supply of computer chips, even when a global pandemic hits, or God forbid, they need them if there's a geopolitical event, and the Chinese decide to seize a major island that happens to be home to so many computer chips, like Taiwan, right? So these arguments, as I've just sort of laid out, I guess you asked me earlier how I make the case. This is how I make the case. And then if there's sort of wonky economic arguments, I go down to another layer of complexity. But I think most Americans get this. It doesn't fit, it doesn't dovetail nicely into government should never be involved in the economy sloganeering. But we're not paid to sloganeer in the end. We're paid to make, to discern and to make hard arguments to our constituents, and then if you do that over a period of time, you might actually earn the trust of your constituents and make this whole place work.
Do you think chips are unique in this respect, or are there other things kind of in the queue in your mind?
I think there are other things that will be required, but I'm very reluctant to volunteer what those things should be. I'm not eager to jump into industrial policy and a whole array of verticals. So let's start with the national security argument. If someone can make a very strong national security or economic security, that is, we can't have the supply chains interrupted because it'll impose a cost beyond the firm or the individual level to extend to entire communities, then I'm open to that argument. So what might some of these areas be? Aviation might be one of those areas. We need to maintain strength as it pertains to aviation. We need to continue to have a vibrant life sciences ecosystem. Now, I've just identified two areas that have a very clear and very direct nexus to our national security. When you start to move beyond that nexus, I grow uncomfortable. And I'll go back to the word discernment. At some point, you'll have to make a call. These things don't lend themselves to formulaic answers always.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you choose those three. This is, something that we've been very interested in and studied looking at American policy in the 20th century, where, notwithstanding the claims that we were some Hayekian, paradise of some sort, it was very clear the federal government had chosen 3 areas where the U.S. absolutely had to lead, and they were life sciences, aerospace, and electronics. And first of all, it's very interesting to see, in a sense, to the extent it counts as picking winners, to notice that aerospace is probably important.
How many winners have we picked in the tax code? Like, how many winners have we chosen? And I challenge anyone to tell me from an economic standpoint, not a congressional budget office or a joint tax standpoint, but an economic standpoint, why direct expenditures are different than tax expenditures. So we do this all the time. And the question should be, is that a wise strategic bet by government? Is it a wise strategic bet to say, the market's not giving us enough research and development? We want more, so we're going to create a tax incentive. And so I think we should grow a lot more comfortable trusting our judgment and going back to the models that were taught to inform that judgment, but not allowing those to become sort of superficial crutches,
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And the other thing that
like the Garmins that take us into cul-de-sacs, right? Stop looking at your phone at some point, right? Stop looking at your phone. It's a cul-de-sac. Turn around, right?
Unless you're surfing AmericanCompass.org, you'll find Rebuilding American Capitalism available in mobile form.
Right.
But no, it's also interesting thinking about some of the policies you were speaking about at the outset. It strikes me that to the extent we can embrace policies that make industry broadly more attractive and let the market figure out what and how to invest, but making things relatively more attractive than whatever else we have an awful lot of people spending their time on today, that's also a way out of the cul-de-sac, in that it gets us what we want and need in terms of the industrial strength, the research, the jobs, the communities, without having to slide too much beyond those few core industries into just into every corner of the economy.
Yes, so I'd agree with that statement. I also think, and I may be stirring the pot a little bit here, but that's the intention.
Please do.
I think the thing that the Biden administration has been missing most as it pertains to their industrial policies is trade. If we're going to engage in a strategic decouple from China, and there's really a national security imperative to do so, why don't we double and triple down on our trade relations with other countries with whom we are coordinating in our own production strategies, right? There should be concentric circles of trust. The most high-end logic chips that go into our nuclear weapons platforms need to be made here. They need to be radiation hardened. They need to be trusted microelectronics, like the very ones that are tested at Crane, Indiana. But no, they really do. But other things that are important to our economy, but maybe we could sustain ourselves for an extended period of time in the midst of shortage. Maybe we can trust the Canadians to produce those, right? Or the Japanese. So let's work together collectively and pool our economic strength vis-a-vis the CCP, because they can never keep up if we do that.
I don't trust the Canadians at all, but the others, the others I'm on board with. No, it's
dog whistle, right?
That's the core of the populist agenda is the Canadian fight. I think that point about the sort of concentric circles is really important, and there's the element of sort of nearshoring that rightly gets a lot of attention. It's also very interesting in the context of what the Trump administration did, and one thing the Biden administration carried forward, which is the very targeted tariffs on particular categories of Chinese goods. And some people have looked at that and said, well, it didn't close the trade deficit, so it didn't work. But if you look at the things we put the tariffs on, imports from China on that stuff plummeted. And so is that is that something you would want to see more of as we think about the strategic decoupling, is basically doing whatever it takes to force that production out of China, but recognize there are a lot of places it can go?
I certainly would be comfortable with that if I saw a robust diplomatic effort to try and ensure we bring the Europeans and the Japanese in particular along with us, other large economy blocs and countries, because otherwise we're just stealing market share, right? The U.S. will self-indulgently apply the tariffs or remove ourselves from accessing the Chinese market, and the Europeans will swoop in and steal market share. So you have to find your way around that dynamic, and I think the only way is through robust diplomacy. But yes, if.
Yeah. All right, I want to spend a couple minutes on non-competes, because it's such a great, concrete, tangible issue. Everybody understands. Everybody's sat down to start a job, and right before they can start, pile of papers is slunked down in front of them that they're expected to sign. Who knows what's in it? Even if you do read it and realize you don't like what's in it, what are you going to do? Get up and walk away and say, never mind? It's one of those places where the Chicago school philosophy seems so obviously to fall on its face, and yet I think there's still, I mean, you're trying to push the legislation. There is still that resistance, that idea that, well, but wait a minute, in the market, workers will go to employers that don't have non-competes if they don't like non-compete. I think that's the argument.
Yeah. Our job is, in large measure, to define the parameters of the market. In this case, the terms of the employment relationship. And then after having defined those parameters and from time to time redefine them, sure, we allow the market to work, but this is about the freedom to leave. I've worked for multiple employers where they had an unquestioned ability. I was an at-will employment relationship. So they could terminate me if they didn't like my political views, if they didn't like how I dressed, if they didn't like me for whatever reason at a particular moment, any day. So under those terms, and there's reasons we have those sorts of employment relationships, it makes our labor market pretty efficient, unless you trap employees in that relationship and don't give them the freedom to leave and apply their skills where they can be applied, where there's the most economic value added, in a place that is consistent with their dreams and aspirations, or allow them to leave and go start their own business somewhere, which is really how most economic development these days occurs. So having laid that predicate, I mean, this makes lots of sense. The vast majority of the American people will be with us on this. It's not as though this is something I dreamed up, right, this reform idea. What I've just laid out, this freedom to leave, has long been the law of the land in Oklahoma, in California. For all its faults and problems, the state of California does not lack for innovation. North Dakota, so three states, Oklahoma and North Dakota, California, that have very different economies from one another. And I've looked into this. There have been no grievances, to my knowledge, about this from employers, because these functioning labor markets provide an ongoing, flood of employees to employers who folks want to work for. I mean, that's just how this works. Attorneys, having been an attorney for a short period of time and having advised new businesses in particular about the sort of legal structures they should set up, I understand why they recommend to business people to have their employees sign a non-compete. It's not only in the employer's economic interest, but it is a broad and highly inclusive legal instrument. It is overbroad and over-inclusive. So the reservations that are vocalized by some business leaders are, they're going to steal all my intellectual property. No, they're not. We have existing trade secrets law. Well, it's a sales business. They're going to steal my sales lists. We have non-solicitation agreements, which are much narrower. So there are existing legal instruments that can fill these narrow concerns, and that's what we need to move to. The FTC has acted some, but I think this is an area where Congress really needs to speak. The GAO just produced a report in this area indicating that non-competes can constrain the wages the rank-and-file workers get, reduce the rate of business creation, impinge upon our labor mobility at a time when so many businesses really need it. And we've seen in states where non-competes are enforced vigorously that they have much higher rates of business failure for the first few years, and then those businesses that make it past year 5 aren't as large as businesses similarly situated in states where there's not a lot of non-compete enforcement. So the evidence is there, and we're just in the process of trying to get members of Congress to act.
Final
Thanks for the
question.
platform.
That was actually final question. It segues well into a final question. I think I've been struck in your work generally, even in these answers, you are focused on building coalitions and consensus and actually getting things done. I'm more of like I'm just going to say what I think and ever, go pound sand kind of guy, which I say is a compliment to you, to be clear. But something that you highlight there in the non-compete context is the business community. And whereas historically Republicans, conservatives have been sort of very tightly aligned with business interests, there's a sense that they're sort of breaking up now. And yet on something like non-competes, the ideal outcome isn't a breakup. It is a mutual understanding that businesses aren't really being reasonable in a sense. They don't actually, to your point, need this instrument, and there's sort of a better way forward that ideally they could get on board with in a sense. And I'm curious how that goes. How do you find actually bringing the business community along to recognize that some things do have to change?
Well, I'll sort of wrap where we began, and it was the University of Chicago. University of Chicago, not only this sort of libertarian economic school, Hayekian in nature, but it's also where much of behavioral economics germinated, right? People forget that. And I think, and this is something I also had the opportunity to discuss at the school, I think that the most powerful bias I'm aware of that we have sort of baked into our DNA is status quo bias. And it's hard to overcome, but the only tool we really have at our disposal to address it is self-awareness, and if you're relying on someone else to help you out, persuasion. So I try and bring facts to the table, and it's amazing how many business people respond to facts if you have the courage to present them with uncomfortable facts. Sometimes it takes a couple of conversations. Sometimes it takes following up with supporting evidence, and there's a risk to having these conversations, right? A risk that someone will never support you again, a risk that they'll share with others things that aren't entirely accurate, anti-business or something. But generally, you can not only win these arguments, but you can bring others into these arguments and provide them a measure of reassurance that you're going to address their fears. People are generally, in my experience, they don't shy away from change per se. They fear loss. And if you can tell them you're really not going to lose much, in fact, you might gain, then you'll address their concerns. And we owe this to our workers. We owe this to our community. If we want to be faithful to real capitalism, which ensures that not only our businesses, but also our consumers and workers and other stakeholders are empowered and sustain support throughout our country for capitalism, we need to make these arguments. And you help us do so, particularly on the home stretch of the CHIPS and Science Act, Oren, when you piped up, and this was, I think, a couple of days before the vote, and folks were just going crazy, and many knew that we had to get this thing passed for the good of the country, but they were experiencing great consternation and maybe looking for an off-ramp. And we had a prominent newspaper, which I may have mentioned earlier, is sort of reductive editorializing at the 11th hour. And I think you're about the only scholar who really leaned in and said, listen, the emperor has no clothes. Here's why. Chips and science is in the best interest of the country. So I thank you for that. Let's continue to do some good together.
Thank you so much, Senator. Really appreciate you being here and looking forward to working together.